Strikes, the latest cyber hot topics. Now, what happens when lightning strikes? Your skin starts tingling, your hair stands on end, you might experience pain throughout your body, maybe your heart's stopping, it feels like the world's on fire. But for those of you in the room who've dealt with the cyber crisis, you know those feelings all too well. So we've tried to come up with a lightning round of 7 hot topics on cybersecurity. I'd like to introduce our panel to you. Ted Claypool at the very end is a partner with Womble Bond Dickinson. And then to his left is Lucy Thompson, who's a principal with the Livingston PLLC. And then Kim Peretti, who's the partner and co-lead of the cybersecurity practice at Alston & Bird. And I'm Ruth Hilbrough, your moderator. I'm a privacy and cybersecurity attorney. And 3 of us, Ted, Lucy, and I, are all in the American Bar Association's AI task force. So welcome, and let's get going with the lightning round. And there's a disclaimer. All right, so here are our 7 lightning round topics. First, we're going to talk about AI invading our brains. Now that sounds fun, doesn't it? Second, battle strategies against today's ransomware actors. Third, the new groundbreaking executive order that is going to protect Americans' sensitive personal data. Fourth, the promise of Gen AI versus privacy promises. That's my lightning round topic. Then we'll move on to cyber insurance and war exclusions. Next, we'll talk about that SEC and other legal duties to protect your operational technology. And then we'll end with preparation. What do we do to be prepared for cybersecurity crises at the board level and beyond? Okay, so Ted, take it away. Do we have a legal right to brain privacy?
Yes, I'm going to talk about what scientists call brain spray. Go ahead and advance.
Okay.
Thank you. Between the time that these slides were due a couple months ago and now, the state of Colorado has passed and signed into law, the governor signed into law, a neuro privacy protection that is an update to their omnibus privacy law in Colorado. And it's interesting that people are confused about this. The country of Chile has neuroprivacy and the right to make your own opinions as a constitutional right in Chile. And state of California is looking at adding neuroprivacy as a sensitive topic that needs to be treated with extra care under their privacy laws. Their rules on this just passed the Senate Judiciary Committee about a week ago. So we have real law on this area, but I've been talking about it for 15 years and it's getting more and more urgent. The reason that it's an issue is because there is a lot of equipment out there now that can read what you are thinking, your thoughts, your emotions, your attention, and other pieces of what's happening in your brain from outside your head. Okay, and this is becoming an issue. It's becoming an issue in the workplace. One of the things that people are using, and over 500 companies are using it now, is a special hat that measures attention. And you would say, why would somebody put their employees in that? Well, if your employees are driving a semi-truck or your employees are operating, 50 tons worth of mining equipment, you may want to have something that makes sure that they're not falling asleep while they're doing it. But part of the problem is they're not using it just for that. Lots of companies are using this. There's been some litigation in Australia about it. There's been some litigation in the UK, and one of the issues is that if we combine the sensors, which are not difficult because something can sense your brain activity, just generally what's happening in your brain from outside your head. If you combine that with the AI that can start to interpret what those readings mean, then it becomes an interesting issue And it becomes a legal issue because can your employer be looking at your brainwaves? Can you get fired because they don't think your attention was enough? In Dubai, they're actually using a technology and there was one man that confessed later. He was convicted, but he was convicted because he confessed because the detector showed that he recognized the gun that was involved in the crime they were talking about while he was being interrogated. And it lit up and said, yes, he's seen this gun before. So this is coming. On top of that, Elon Musk and others are building computer-brain interfaces. Now they're using them right now for people that are paraplegic, quadriplegic, and need to be able to have an interface that allows them to interact with the physical world through their brain activity. So I only am getting 5 minutes, so I will jump out in a minute, but I just want everybody to know that's where this is coming from. The technology is getting more and more intrusive. It's not that hard to run. You can buy something that works like this on Amazon. You can help your meditation with it. I've got a guy that we had dinner with last night 15 years ago showed me in his office he had a helicopter you can control with your mind. Now it's not hard because all it does is what other biometric reading devices do, right? In other words, it reads one thing and then when it reads it again it compares the two. And if they match, then it does something. If it doesn't match, then it doesn't do anything. And so all you have to do is train it when you wear the hat and you're thinking forward, 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 backward, 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 left, 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 right, 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 up, 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 down, down, down. It now knows what each of those means, and when you think up, it lifts the thing up. So it's that simple, but it's also becoming more simple to figure out analysis of what part of your brain fills up with blood when you're happy, when you're upset, when you see something that frightens you. So being able to do this from a distance is going to be problematic. I mean, for that particular thing, you need an fMRI, a $2 million machine that you have to sit still in right now, but we all know the technology gets better. And the day that the car dealer can sit there from across the showroom and point it at you and say, he's ready to buy the car now, is the day that we're all in trouble. So I just wanted everybody to be aware that this is coming and it's already coming in the law.
And on that happy note, lightning is going to strike again. Let me see. Battle strategies against today's ransomware actors. Kim?
Well, as we all might be in trouble from a privacy standpoint there, we all might be in trouble from continuing explosion in ransomware attacks. They're here to stay. I think we had a feeling there was a little bit of a brief reprieve in 2022, but last year was another hit year. Ransomware actors received in ransom payments over $1 billion. That, in combined with the past couple of years, means that these actors have obtained several $1 billion. So the model is working for them. They are successful in getting people to pay ransom. So let's talk a little bit more about that increase. 37% increase last year. A lot of that is due to this model that's developing called ransomware as a service. So you have these core groups of ransomware. They develop a variant, and then basically these outliers, groups or individuals license that technology and use that to deploy the ransomware and commit attacks, and then they get a commission from the core group of the payment, and that has exploded. More and more actors, more and more affiliates, individuals are joining these attacks and able to perpetrate them successfully. The average cost is now up to $5 million without the ransom payment. Another statistic, that the average ransom is $1.54 million. And we've seen payments in the tens of millions of dollars repeatedly. So this is all a major shift starting in 2019 when these criminal actors put two things together. One was doing a data breach, getting into systems and stealing data, and then following at the last stage of the attack with deploying the ransomware itself. Before, they were just sort of spraying the internet, encrypting one system here or there, and a $200, asking for a $200 demand. Again, much of that changed in 2019 when they get into systems, they are able to steal information and demand higher amounts of money. These are really multi-extortion techniques. So it's not just asking to pay a ransom because all your systems are locked up and you need your data back. It's also extorting the company because if they steal the data and you don't pay them, they will leak the data on established leak sites on the dark web. Well, you might say, well, who's going to go to the dark web? Well, a lot of security companies, the government, others follow and track these leak sites, and then when something is leaked on them, they publicize that. So they extort you not to have your sensitive data published on leak sites. You might ask, well, what are they stealing? They're getting into systems and stealing terabytes of data, and they're doing it successfully. They're doing it in a way because they have so much money that they've intook, right? Billions of dollars. They use that to perfect their activities. One of the things that they do with that, that they've perfected, is being able to get in systems and shorten the time that they're in systems to do their reconnaissance, to put their tools down, and then to have scripts run out, predefined scripts to grab the data they want on hundreds of systems. They have perfected those techniques looking at the way we do data inventories and the way we do data flows and mapping. So they've gotten very good at the ability to steal data. Now, if you didn't want to pay to get maybe you have good backups. You don't have to pay for that decryptor tool. And maybe they didn't get sensitive data, and that's fine if you take the chance they're going to leak some company data. But they have new extortion techniques that they're using. One is they contact your customers. If they get any customer data, they'll contact that customer and extort that customer to pay them to not leak their data. They threaten employees. Now they're actually threatening pets too. They threaten employees' families. They threaten executives. They send things to executives' homes that are unpleasant packages. And the latest has been that they contact regulators. There was even one group that filed an SEC complaint because the company did not file an 8K disclosure, and they wanted to let the SEC know that they believe that entity should have because it was subject to a significant ransomware attack. So lots going on in this area, and we just actually had a law enforcement arrested the head of one of the most prolific groups that was just announced yesterday, Lockbit. So we are seeing more law enforcement activity in this area, but these groups are increasing. There were 500 new variants last year. Big numbers there. So how are they getting in? How is it so that they can attack these systems? They're pretty traditional methods. One is phishing. Someone clicks on a link and that puts some malware on that individual's computer, and it steals all kinds of credentials that they have access to, or else they give their credentials as a part of a phishing attack. Very, very common. Another is more sophisticated in this social engineering. There's a group out there, a couple groups now, that are very, very good at MFA bypass. So even though we have systems with MFA now that keeps a lot of those phishing exploits from not working, they're very successful in being able to push bomb, they call it. Send one, get the credentials and then keep sending it, the individual or the user text to approve their MFA. And then at some point the user gets very tired and just hits approve. Then they are in the system using the credentials and bypassed MFA. Another one is unmanaged devices. So a lot of companies have in data center or various places on their network a device that they might believe someone else, a vendor, is managing for them, and it ends up it's just sitting out there. It hasn't been patched, and it's not managed. It doesn't have security tools on. The criminals are very good at finding those systems. And then also any system out there that doesn't have MFA, that just uses user credentials to be able to access the system, VPN that doesn't have MFA or other remote access systems. There's usually some system out there on a big, wide network that doesn't have MFA, and the criminals find that very quickly. So then moving over to what does a response look like? What do you need to be thinking about? And these are, ransomware is very different. If you want to go to the next slide. Ransomware is very different, a ransomware response, than other types of cybercrime, and primarily because so much happens at once, and you have to be able to stand up and respond very quickly in many different work streams. One is restoration. Your systems are taken down. We all depend on our networks, and even a little bit of downtime can cause significant disruption. So a work stream that understands what the business impact is, what systems have been encrypted, how you might restore those systems, whether you have backups, and whether, if you don't have backups, whether you might need to rebuild, what the rebuilding would look like. That in and of itself is one of the most critical, important work streams. The second one is to investigate. The criminals in these situations know more than you, so you're racing against the clock. They're going to tell you they've stolen terabytes of data, they have your data, and that you can't operate because your systems are encrypted, and you need to investigate to see what's true, what did they take, how did they get in, how do you contain it. So a whole separate work stream on investigation that's fairly typical to other types of cyber investigations. Legal, very, very important. Legal is going to be running the the threat actor interactions. Even if you have no desire to pay, you're likely going to want to reach out to that threat actor to make sure they don't take steps as a delay tactic, and legal's going to run that. You have privilege issues, you have preservation issues, and just a whole host of legal issues, especially when it comes to paying the ransom and whether that's legal or not. And then finally, communications. You can imagine if your systems are down, email systems are down, employees all of a sudden can't get access to certain systems or can't get access to their email. Going to be very important for how you're going to communicate with them. You're going to communicate with all of your employees or just a handful of your employees. What about your customers? You've got about 48 to 72 hours when these attacks hit before someone's going to know what's going on and is going to suspect that that's ransomware. What's your communication strategy to internal stakeholders and external stakeholders, and standing that up very quickly?
So as if your very bad, terrible day weren't worse enough, you mentioned the SEC, which leads us to our next lightning strikes topic. Well, actually, no, it's the executive order topic.
Yeah,
We'll save the SEC for later. All right, Lucy?
So think back to 2015, if you will. Do you remember the Office of Personnel Management breach? More than 21 million records were stolen by some state-sponsored actors. I was at a judicial conference the day the judges were notified that all their background data was stolen and was on the road to China. And these judges, who don't even at the time didn't want to use smartphones, were absolutely astounded. They were staring at their phones saying, how could this have happened? So there have been so many hundreds of breaches since then. But now the government has on its radar the problem of the sale of bulk data to what they call countries of concern. And this is now what the White House is calling a groundbreaking executive order, which is going to prohibit the sale of our data and to these different countries. And the reason is that the intelligence community has said that this is a national security concern, and they've actually documented the kinds of things that are being done by these nation states: extortion, various crimes. You can see that on the slide, and the kinds of data is quite a list of sensitive data that they're very concerned about. If you go to the next slide. The kinds of data that are being, let's see, where is that? The prohibited data in the transactions that are being addressed are data brokerage data that we're all familiar with. The data brokers are, without our knowledge or consent, collecting everything from the loyalty programs to where we browse on the internet. Genomic data has now been flagged. vendor-related data, employment, investment, financial data. So the executive order was issued on February 28th, and the Justice Department has been given the lead enforcement authority for this executive order. So they issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. It's a very interesting document. It goes through all the different strategies that the Justice Department plans to take to prohibit these transactions. And there's different categories of transactions that are prohibited, and you can read about those. They're going to have rules about licensing of certain transactions. Some of them are prohibited. Some of them, the companies can apply for approval to sell the data. The prohibited, the countries of interest, sorry, they didn't set this up so we could see the slides very well, are China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela. So any entity that's either owned by one of those companies or is run by an employee of the company or an agent of the company cannot purchase this bulk data. So it'll be very interesting. I think from a privacy standpoint, the data that they've flagged as being highly sensitive is going to potentially pose a new list for us to work with of private data, because it's such a broad list. And clearly the government is very concerned about all this. So watch for continued rulemaking on this topic, because it should be very important in the privacy and security landscape.
Great. So now we are talking about privacy. You've been hearing threads of privacy throughout most of this. And this one is about Prometheus. How many of you remember Prometheus from? Yeah. Oh, well, Prometheus was known, he's one of the Titans, and he was known as the god of fire. Why? Because he defied the gods and he decided to steal the fire and give it to humanity, because he thought it was very important that humanity have it. And some say that was the first technology. And I've actually heard here at RSA a few people talking about comparing AI to the fire, you know, et cetera, because it's so powerful and transformative. And, you know, fire can, just like AI, for example, can be a dual-edged sword. It has promise and peril, it can enlighten, and it can disrupt. So I've got a few thoughts there about I feel like the promise of Gen AI is like stealing fire from the gods. Now, let's hope that our using Gen AI and is not going to subject us to the treatment that Prometheus had. He was tortured for the rest of his life. One might argue he made a titanic mistake. And then Gen AI, of course, we know is fueled by data and a lot of personal data. And we have, especially when we're thinking about data, we have to be concerned about sensitive, especially sensitive data. Because that is where most of the attention is going to come from regulators, from the media, from legislators, et cetera. Information related to children, information related to health, or financial information, sometimes biometrics information. Because biometrics, if you think about it, is the one kind of thing we cannot change. We could change our social security number, we can't change our face, can't change our hands, can't change that iris scan. So it's viewed more and more as being sensitive, and Gen AI can easily just be very fast in terms of taking those images and mapping them. So we have to be thinking about all the data that is fueling AI, and all of us as consumers, as individuals, as employees, a lot of our data is going into that. But I bet you didn't know that 40 years ago, a song was already written about this. Have you heard Every Breath You Take by the Police? Every breath you take, every move you make, every bond you break, every step you take, I'll be watching you. Every single day and every word you say, every game you play, every night you say, I'll be watching you. Oh, can't you see you belong to me? how my AI is staked on every step you take. And then if you were gone, I'd be lost without a trace. When you dream at night, I can only see your face. I look around, but it's you I can't replace. I feel so bold, and I invade your personal space. I keep watching, baby, baby. Please, it's so easy. So every prompt you make, and every day you wake, every selfie smile you fake, and every pill you take, I'll be watching you. And if that sounds extreme, I mean, we really are being watched all the time. Here, we're on camera in various places. We're being scanned every time we walked in somewhere. And I think with generative AI, it's just going to enable a lot more surveillance. So we're going to have fired up responses in response to this sort of fire. Regulators, data protection authorities, the Federal Trade Commission, early on they jumped on AI, the Federal Trade Commission, and they made their first the tech summit. They had the first tech summit in January that was focused on AI, and then their privacy con that they hold annually in March had a lot of AI in it as well. They are always issuing guidance on this, and their concern about biometrics goes back over a decade. So really watch FTC as probably the primary regulator moving in this space. And litigation, we've seen a lot on biometrics, related to biometrics, including, this is pre-Gen AI, but the Illinois BIPA goes back 14 years in regulating biometrics. And then we've also got legislation emerging a lot, the comprehensive state laws. I think the number is up to 17 now, and then we have others that are being considered, and a lot of them restrict automated decision making. There are other things that can come into play that we need to be able to watch. There's also a couple of more and more laws emerging about children. We've got California, Connecticut, and Florida that have new child-related laws. So you can't just look at things that necessarily say privacy, but look at ones that have privacy implications. And then that last point there about the court of public opinion. I've often tell my clients that it doesn't matter in some ways if you're complying with the law and doing everything legal. Beyond that, you will be tried in the court of public opinion. So you've got to recognize that the law is just one factor, and you've got to be looking at the bigger picture as well, and always picturing how in that story, that's the headline, are you going to be able to write a good story about what you did and what processes you had in place, and what consumer-facing notices and interaction you've had. Okay, so lightning strikes in the form of cyber insurance.
Excellent. We're going to talk a little bit about cyber insurance. Okay, good. We're going to talk about the war exclusion. The war exclusion has been part of the insurance industry for a long time. As you can imagine, in the last century, if your plant was destroyed by an earthquake and you had insurance, that was what the insurance was for. It was to help you out. But if your plant was destroyed because the neighbor invaded and destroyed everything in your region, it was likely that the insurance company would say, because this was an act of war, this is excluded. Okay, well, that's pretty simple because we're talking physical damage, and we're talking one kind of insurance. But now we've moved into a world where there's cyber insurance and there's cyber attacks. And early on, the cyber insurance industry tried to trigger this unsuccessfully, particularly in the Merck case, where the NotPetya virus came out and essentially was pushed out in an earlier conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but it also went and attacked, although it attacked lots of Ukrainian businesses, it also sort of slipped out of its bounds and started to attack other businesses, including Merck. And you know, they had to shut down for a long time, and it was a serious problem, and they filed an insurance claim, and the insurance company said, no, this was an act of war, because this was one country going after another country, and you just happened to get in the way. Essentially, as often happens in the insurance industry, when the industry pushes the boundaries, the courts push back. Because generally speaking, unless it's fairly specific in an insurance policy that they can exclude what you paid for, or you thought you paid for, the judges are going to probably find with a client on this. And so the insurance industry, seeing more and more potential problems in this area, are trying to broaden this out. What we've really seen, and the interesting piece here, do we have this? Yeah, the Lloyd's of London exclusions. After a couple of cases came out, both in the US and Europe, Lloyd's of London has said, we really need to rethink these war exclusions because they need to cover more than they are covering right now. And so cyber operation, I want you to read that, means the use of a computer system by or on behalf of a state to disrupt, deny, degrade, manipulate, or destroy information in a computer system of or in another state. In another state? I mean, they're all in a state. And so, you know, that is very, very broad. And they're clearly writing it so they can trigger it wherever they can. As you might imagine, the whole concept of what is a war is, you know, whether you take the Clausewitz definition or you look, you know, at what countries do, countries try and keep it fairly broad because there are things that China is doing to us, probably as we sit here right now, that could easily be considered acts of war. But we also don't want to start sending troops over there. And so we want the ability to say, no, we don't classify that as an act of war. However, from the insurance industry standpoint, they don't want that much flexibility. They would definitely like to say, you know, if Russia sends out a virus that hurts all the rest of us in the West, that they're doing this as an act of war, and therefore the insurance industry doesn't have to cover your losses. And so the insurance industry is trying to broaden this out. There's been action going back and forth on it. Of course, there's also an issue not only of what is damage, because clearly physical damage is damage, but is shutting down your business the kind of damage that we're talking about. And what if, you know, it's one thing if the Chinese military is sending people after you, that's pretty clear. It's another thing if some hacker group outside of Minsk is being encouraged both by their own government and the Russian government, who is protecting them, and who says, you know, it'd be nice if you sent something after these guys. You know, is that an act of war? Is that a state-sponsored activity? A lot of questions there, and we're going to spend a lot of the next 10 years probably litigating this and figuring it out.
Right. Well, our next lightning bolt is going to be the SEC and how they can spell trouble for you.
So last year we looked at the topic was C-suite targeted for cybersecurity shortcomings, and we focused on national security risks, and particularly at that time the damage from ransomware, which Kim opened the window for us, and software supply chain attacks. And so now we have the question a year later, how are companies doing? And the SEC rules for disclosing material incidents in Form 8K is now in effect. And the incentive there was to encourage companies by having to disclose this information to strengthen their security posture. And this morning, Jen Easterly, in one of the keynotes, said companies need to do much more. So these SEC 8Ks give us a window into what some of these companies are doing. You want to go to the next slide?
Sure.
So the 8K is filed when a material incident occurs, and the purpose is to, quote, provide investors with information they need to make informed investment and voting decisions, in each case as necessary or appropriate in the public interest or for the protection of investors. And what is a material cybersecurity incident that must be disclosed is definitely a challenge for cyber professionals. And the SEC uses the standard of materiality that's applied to many other types of activities, but this is the first for cyber. So companies are working through the question of, in a breach, what's material. There's an objective standard that the SEC has set forth about assessing various quantitative and qualitative factors, what sensitive information was disclosed, the impact on brand or reputation. The companies are also required to disclose on an annual basis the risk management strategy and governance steps that they've taken. So I want to focus on 3 companies that have filed these 8Ks since last September, because they give you a window into what the companies are thinking. And actually, it's interesting that they all suffered major social engineering attacks and ransomware attacks. So Clorox was the first one, and that breach occurred in mid-August of 2023. You can get these 8Ks from the EDGAR SEC system, and they're pretty interesting to read because they're fairly brief. In fact, what they look like to me are these privacy policies that the companies put on their websites where they say we're doing different things, like nothing's going on here. So that's the sort of impression that you get from reading these 8K disclosures. Clorox was forced to take its automated ordering system down because of this ransomware attack. And it took them a month to recover. So they filed 3 8Ks. The SEC recommends that within 4 days, the company is required to post an 8K and then update it as necessary. So the first filing said that Clorox identified unauthorized activity with some of its IT systems, and then filed another filing a month later, September 14th, where they said there was a cyber attack where it had to operate at a lower rate of order processing, which meant that stores couldn't get bleach and other products that they needed. They said there would be a material impact in the Q1 financial results. And as a result of that filing, their stock price dropped 2% that day. And then the next filing was October 4th, where they put out a press release saying net sales are expected to decrease by 28% from the previous quarter a year ago. So there's not a lot of detail about the breach, but there are some predictions about the stock prices. So the next 2 filings are both major casinos in Las Vegas, and they were hit by an attack by a company or a threat actors called Scattered Spider, and they used social media attacks to gain access to the system. So MGM was the first that suffered a breach. Caesars suffered a breach a week later. So on September 12th, MGM filed a very short little filing that said they'd begun an investigation. They were shutting down their systems. They would implement measures to bring their business operations back up. Then October 5th, they filed a much more detailed statement. But this one really reads like a privacy statement where they said we've notified customers that much of their personal data was stolen, including social security numbers and passport numbers for some of the people. shut down certain systems, but no statement that there was any material breach. And then the last company was Caesars, and they were breached by the same cyber activities within a breach, and they actually had their loyalty program database stolen, and the data was put on the dark web like Kim said they would, and they notified individuals and went through the same thing. So you can read all these if you're interested, but it's very interesting that there's no declarations of any material breaches, even though most of us would consider these to be major attacks. So Kim's going to talk about what needs to be done to get ready and prepare for and address these kind of breaches. But the most important thing that you might want to think about is what is the SEC going to do for enforcement? Because if they consider these 8K filings to be inadequate, they can take enforcement action and levy fines against these companies. So for all of you working with companies, it'll be interesting to see how you all work through this whole question of filing these declarations.
Great. Okay, Kim, take us to our last lightning bolt, and then time for a couple questions.
Okay, so last lightning bolt is why do you need to be prepared? Just like for physical threats, if you live in California, your company might have a disaster recovery plan, a crisis management plan for an earthquake. If you live in Kansas, your company should have a crisis plan for responding to a tornado. Same with cyber responses. They are crisis events. Much of what I do is run a crisis management practice, and the list that you see up here is actually the things that we consider when we're helping companies respond to a significant cyber attack in the first 48 to 72 hours. You might have up to 5 different vendors to hire: a data recovery firm, a ransomware intermediary, a forensic firm, a PR firm, are just some examples. As Lucy just mentioned, now with the SEC rules, if you're a public company, you're going to need to be thinking about whether what just happened to your systems is material, and you need to plan for filing an 8K within 4 days. Your boards of directors are actively engaged in exercising their oversight role, both from the cybersecurity standpoint and from an incident response standpoint. So you might need to be reporting the matter to the board. You might have to consider placing restrictions on insider trading, so that no one's trading on non-public material information. Then you have all the things with incident response, identifying a containment strategy. How are you going to become comfortable that the criminals are no longer in your system? What's your remediation strategy? What IPs are you going to block? Passwords are you going to change? A whole litany of tactical items to help recover and restore and remediate systems that might be infected. Communications is key, setting up a communication strategy, identifying data exfiltration. These are all things to think about and to plan for in the first 48 to 72 hours. So it's crisis management. And so what are next slide? How do we prepare? We prepare by having plans, testing those plans. I think most importantly is we generally have plans that account for the technical side of an incident. How do you collect the forensic information, the chain of custody? How do you do the eradication and containment? But having a plan that's cross-functional for a crisis event that involves the communication side, the legal, the risk side, and that is not just run by IT or information security. Often we call it an enterprise crisis response plan. It's going to be very similar to your crisis management plans for other enterprise risks, but there's so many unique aspects to cyber that we often are seeing, and companies find it very helpful to have that enterprise cyber response plan. And then test it at multiple levels. Test it at the technical level with just the IT team and the information security team. Test it with executive, or test it with the frontline incident response team, the first responders, the cross-functional individuals who help on all those different work streams we talked about. Then you want to test it at the executive level. So run through a mock exercise that involves the frontline people, escalating it up to the executives, and seeing how the executives handle it, how they discuss it, what the key decisions are that they need to be aware of. And now the latest round is tested at the board level. The new NACD board guidance that came out identifies that boards should be involved in a tabletop exercise with management. And that has become a very common, or for some companies, we're seeing that having boards, aware of what their oversight role is, training them on that oversight role, seeing how they work with management, because ultimately you don't want the board taking over. They're not running the company, they're not managing the operations of the response, but they need to be actively engaged. I think that's a very important point that we're seeing board involvement in. On the SEC materiality side, very important to start documenting the questions you would be asking, the considerations, because it's quantitative, it's qualitative in the event of a significant cyber incident. So make sure you have that documented in advance, those considerations, and then the process for when you escalate to the team that will make a decision about whether an incident is material. Can't not talk about preparation without a really good, solid communications strategy. So much of a cyber response is based on and the need for communicating with various stakeholders, customers in particular. The consumer side is actually surprisingly somewhat more simple. We know how to make notices, we have our facts, we have our credit monitoring. The harder part is your business partners and your business customers that may be impacted by an event, maybe their data is impacted. They're going to want to know it's safe to do business with you. How are you going to communicate with them? Is it going to be with certain customers? Is it going to be a town hall? Various things to think about in advance. Very important on the communication side. So those are just some areas to really focus on. Again, it comes back to that planning and the testing of the plans.
And the planning is so important. Henry Ford said that companies don't plan to fail, they fail to plan. But it can often feel overwhelming. You listen to that list that you just gave us, and it can feel overwhelming. But Henry Ford also said nothing is particularly hard if you divide it into small tasks. Yeah. So think about what you can do to help decrease your risk. And in fact, we have on our apply side some things that can help you in that process, some tips to implement. Are there any questions? I don't see anybody at the microphone. No? No, you've already, but anyway, these are just 7. We had to do a lightning round. It's a very short period of time, but as you know, and you see in the broad spectrum of topics that are covered here at RSA, there's so many different ways that lightning can strike, and I would say just watch this space and don't fail to plan. So thank you very much for joining us today.